Muscles. This presentation will be on the different kind of muscle cells and then some specific muscles that we'll be studying for the anatomy and physiology class. We've already gone over the fact that we have smooth muscle, and here we see a stomach model, and of course it would have visceral muscle or smooth muscle inside. The heart will have cardiac muscle that will be in the atria and the ventricles. The blood vessels themselves have smooth muscle or visceral muscle. And then we have two models of a section of a skeletal muscle cell. Here's a large one that we have and a smaller one. I'll be going over those, and then some specific skeletal muscles, particularly on the face, and a few other assignments here. So at this time, I'm going to move the smooth muscle out of the way and get right on to our skeletal muscle cell. Now this is a part of just one single muscle cell. It's a model of that, of course. And we have several terms to learn with muscle, remember. The cell membrane itself would be the sarcolemma. Connective tissue around the cell, an individual cell, is endomysium. Connective tissue around groups of muscle cells, there would be several of these, would be perimysium. And then the connective tissue around the entire muscle, such as the biceps brachii, etc., that connective tissue would be called the epimysium. But here on the inside of the cells, this is a skeletal muscle cell. It's also known as striated muscle because you have these light and dark bands that look like striations. We see them also in this smaller model. Right here looks like little stripes, almost striations. And notice that both of these have the end of a neuron. This is the axon of a neuron coming to it. Here's the buton. And on this side, this represents the motor neuron coming to the muscle, and here the butons where the chemical phase of the impulse will occur. But this represents the cell membrane, which is the sarcolemma. Then the cytoplasm would be the sarcoplasm. You have bundles of myofibrils of the actin and myosin on the inside. This white material represents a modification of the endoplasmic reticulum, and it's called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It's very important. It stores calcium, and then that calcium is released during the contraction, right before the contraction occurs in the muscle cell. And so down here we see another area of it. And then here would be an invagination of the sarcolemma, which is the called the T-tubule. And so from one T-tubule to another is a contractile unit called a sarcomere. Remember, the prefix sarco means muscle. And then this white mass meshwork is the endoplasmic reticulum called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. There are many mitochondria in the muscle cell. Those are called sarcosomes. And so this just, again, shows bundles of the actin and myosin. The thick little red represents the myosin, and the smaller one would be the actin. And then we have the mitochondria called sarcosomes. Here's the end of the buton, and that's showing the vesicles that have the neurotransmitter. The space between the end of the buton and the beginning of the sarcolemma is called the synaptic cleft, and the chemical is released, the acetylcholine is released from the end of the neuron, the buton, into this space, and then it lands on reactive sites on the muscle side, and if enough of it lands, that acts as a stimulus, stage 2 of the impulse, and it starts then on the muscle side. Okay, then over here on this model, skeletal muscle again, you have the sarcolemma, which is the cell membrane, the sarcoplasm, all the living material. You have the bundles, these are myofibrils inside the cell, that's made of actin and myosin. And then here we have a dark line right there, the dark, that represents the invagination of the T-tubule. From T-tubule to T-tubule would be the contractile unit called the here we go, sarcomere. Also, there are lots of sarcomeres. And here the mitochondria, the nucleus. There are many nuclei in the skeletal muscle. Here's one. They're multinucleated. And then here we have the, change hands here. Here is the connective tissue, that would be the endomysium. Here's the neuron that ends in the buton, and the neuron has myelin sheath around it. The yellow is fatty material made up by the Schwann cells. The axon cylinder is right in the center. Where one Schwann cell ends and another begins is a little invagination called the node of Ranvier. We see it here. We also see it over here, and that aids in or helps in a very rapid production of impulses, which appears to jump from node to node, and it's called saltatory conduction. It's saltaire from the French word meaning to leap. It's not salt, S-A-L-T. It's saltaire, and it's saltatory conduction, though, that occurs just at the nodes, and it makes it the impulse travel rapidly because the sodium pump only has to work at the nodes, and it goes very, very rapidly here. All right, then I'm going to move on to the assignments that you're going to have on the muscles, individual muscles. You'll be given a sheet showing the facial muscles, and then if you'll notice on the second page, should have the key for this. And if I put this down, okay, yes, the key is written here for your muscles. You also have this in your lab book, a picture in your lab book, but if you don't have a lab book, you will have this page, and you'll have this on our electrotest, etc. And then we have a model that shows the facial muscles. Now, with all the skeletal muscles, when we talk about the muscular system, we're primarily talking about the skeletal muscle system. We sometimes call it skeletal muscular system. We're going to be talking about origins and insertions of the muscle. That connective tissue that's wrapped around the individual cells, the endomysium, and then around groups of cells, the perimysium, and then around the entire muscle, the epimysium. As that starts approaching the bone where it's going to attach, it forms either a cord or it may form a flat sheet. If it's a flat sheet, it's an aponeurosis. This is the aponeurosis of the muscle that goes from the occipital part right here, occipitalis, and here's the frontalis. It's called the occipitofrontalis because it starts with the occipital and it inserts in the area of the frontal. And then this flat sheet, is the aponeurosis, is called the gala aponeurotica. It's a flat sheet. On some of the others, we'll find tendons, which will be a cord-like structure. But we do have origins and insertions, and then, of course, there's an action of the muscle, and then every skeletal muscle cell has to have a branch of a neuron on it, so you have different nerves coming to it. The nerves that we'll study for the facial muscles and muscles for chewing, well, in the chewing muscle, you have the masseter here, and then I'll turn this around. We can see the muscle on the side, which completely covers the temporal bone, the temporalis. That masseter and temporalis work together to close the jaw, and then there's some muscles on the underside called the pterygoid muscles, the internal and external pterygoid. They begin on the internal and external pterygoid laminae of the sphenoid. They insert on the inside of the mandible. Those muscles for chewing or mastication are innervated by the fifth cranial nerve, which is the trigeminal nerve. Now, on the temporalis, the origin is going to be all on the squamous portion of the temporal bone, and it completely covers that flat portion, that squamous portion of the temporal bone. It comes down and inserts on the coronoid process of the mandible, and then when it works, it closes the jaw. The masseter, and it's on both sides, but it's just shown on this side, the masseter begins on the zygomatic process, the zygomatic arch, which is part of the zygomatic bone and also the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. That originates there, so when the muscle contracts, the origin is still. The insertion is going to be in the mandible, so when this muscle contracts, you close the jaw, it pulls up on the mandible. Okay, so like I said, those four that you are to learn, the temporalis, the masseter, and the internal and external pterygoid muscles, also called the medial and lateral pterygoid. They're all innervated by the fifth cranial nerve, the trigeminal. It's the motor fibers of that trigeminal. All the muscles for facial expression, such as the epicranius or occipitofrontalis, the corrugator supercilii, the orbicularis oculi, the procerus, it closes this to a slit-like opening, nasalis, over the nasal bone, causes compression of the nasal apertures, the zygomaticus major, which starts on the zygomatic bone, or malar, and comes to the edge of this orbicularis oris muscle, pulls it back in a smiley face. The zygomaticus minor starts on the zygomatic, goes to the top of the lip, causes sneering or snarling. The mentalis here in the chin, which causes the lower lip to protrude. And we have the buccinator, which forms the cheek, the wall. It shows think it shows better right here right in here. Forms the cheek wall. Well, these are all innervated by the 7th cranial nerve, the facial nerve. And then there's another one that's not shown on this particular model called the platysma. It starts on the shoulders and neck at the top, comes over the neck and comes to the edge of the orbicularis oris. This is orbicularis oris. This is the mentalis, zygomaticus major, zygomaticus minor, orbicularis oculi, procerus draws this to a slit-like opening, corrugator supercilii, epicranius or occipitofrontalis. Those are the major ones that will be, and the nasalis they're studying for the facial bone. And then for chewing, it would be the temporalis and masseter working together to close the jaw, and the internal and external pterygoids, which move the jaw from side to side. These are involved in mastication or chewing, innervated by the 5th cranial nerve. The muscles for facial expression are innervated by the facial nerve, which has a motor fibers, and that goes to the muscles for facial expression. But the facial nerve also has sensory fibers for the tongue, for some of the taste buds. So it has two functions there. Okay, now I want to go over the little stick figure here. You've all been given the stick figures. You've had those. We had that for movements, like the flexion of the upper arm, abduction of the upper arm for B, so forth. Same stick figures. Okay, then you will be given a typed sheet with all the information on this. And this isn't all the information about these muscles, but this is the information on these muscles that I'm going to hold you responsible for. And so the first one says flexion of the upper arm, and remember that's flexion of the upper arm. And the muscles are the pectoralis major and the anterior fibers of the deltoid. And notice, I don't have an O for origin here, but I do have the I for insertion. So if it has an O, that means it's the origin. That's the part that's relatively still when the muscle contracts. The insertion, I, usually passes by some type of joint or articulation, and it pulls on a bone, a part of a bone, beyond that articulation to cause a movement. And so the I is very important. The insertion is very important because that's the part that's going to move when the muscle contracts. So with the pectoralis major, the insertion is found in the chest, across the pectoral region, and then the insertion is on the greater tubercle of the humerus, which is at the proximal end. And some of you still need to get the trochanters and the tubercle separated, so be sure you go back over that on the bones. So in our lab test, we'll be looking at these bones again, and I'll be asking you which muscle inserts here, and is it an origin or insertion, and what's the action, etc. Okay, then the anterior fibers of the deltoid being that large triangular muscle over the shoulder, and it has an origin and an insertion, so it has O and I. Now they all have an origin and insertion. I'm just not going to hold you responsible for all the origins and insertions. Okay, but if it's on this paper and it has O, then you need to know it. If it has an I, you definitely need to know it. Okay, so the origin is the acromion process and the spine of the scapula and the outer 1/3 of the clavicle. Of course, the 1/3 going toward the acromion process. The insertion is the deltoid tuberosity, and when the anterior fibers of the deltoid work with the pectoralis major and they contract, you have flexion of the upper arm. That's picture A. Okay, now the opposite of that is going to be extension, and that's picture C. So, because it's a straight line here, okay? And then when you decrease the angle, you no longer have a straight line, you have less than 180 degrees, and that's why this is flexion, this is extension, and if you go beyond extension, like C prime, that's hyperextension. Well, the muscles for extension are also the same muscles for hyperextension. Okay, so this would be the posterior fibers of the deltoid, and then a large muscle on the back called the latissimus dorsi. I'm not going to go through each one of these on this little video, but you will have that, so just wanted to go over it and let you see how you're supposed to use this. So for C, you have the opposite. A and C are antagonistic actions here. A is flexion of the upper arm. C stands for extension of the upper arm, so those two actions are antagonistic actions. They're acting against each other. In this case, it's the posterior fibers of the deltoid and the latissimus dorsi. Well, the deltoid still has the same origin and insertion. It's the acromion process and spine of the scapula and the outer 1/3 of the clavicle, and then the insertion is still the deltoid tuberosity, and that of course is on the humerus. Okay, but when it works with the latissimus dorsi, this is a broad muscle across the back. It begins on the iliac crest and the lumbar vertebra and the thoracic vertebra. But I noticed I don't have all that on here. You do need to be able to find it on the larger mannequin models, but you need to know the insertion is the intertrabecular groove. That is the groove, the little depression between the two tubercles. Remember, on the humerus you have a greater tubercle and a lesser tubercle, and the depression between it is the intertrabecular groove. Inter meaning between. And so that huge muscle comes into this area, and when it pulls on that, it pulls the arm back down for extension, and then of course further back for hyperextension. So those are synergistic. They work together for extension and hyperextension. Okay, now the picture B is showing abduction of the upper arm. In this case, it is just the deltoid, the entire deltoid. Now, I didn't rewrite the origin and insertion because it's written here, so you need to know it though for the deltoid. The origin being the acromion process in the spine of the scapula and the outer 1/3 of the clavicle, and the insertion is the deltoid tuberosity of the humerus. And so when the deltoid works alone, you have true abduction because you're moving away from the midline. The opposite of abduction is adduction, and picture D shows adduction. You're bringing the arm back. And of course the movement in all these is the ball and socket joint, and that's where the head of the humerus into the glenoid cavity of the scapula. But here's adduction. Well, the two muscles that were antagonistic for flexion and extension are now going to work together. Oh, okay, and those will be the pectoralis major and the latissimus dorsi. And so you have, picture D, adduction of the upper arm, and it's the pectoralis major and latissimus dorsi. So you need to know the pectoralis major inserts on the greater tubercle of the humerus. Latissimus dorsi inserts on the intertrabecular groove. When they work together, you have adduction of the upper arm. And so continue on this way. We'll be breaking this down and having little quizzes on this daily next week. So start working on that. The first thing we'll have will be the facial muscles, just learning the names of them and how to spell them and their actions. And then if they're innervated by the 7th cranial nerve for facial expression or the 5th cranial nerve, the ones for chewing and mastication. Okay, I'm going to stop the video at this point and then go to another, make another little one of the whole body muscles.